Cox. I'm out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I work for Allstate Insurance Company in litigation services, and I co-chair this task force with Rich Williamson, who is a partner at Robertson, Johnson, Miller, and Williamson in Reno, Nevada. This TIPS task force is dedicated to helping you with the business side of running your law practice. We have a great program today, and we give special thanks to the Thomson Reuters Institute for partnering with us again. Bill Jostin and Isaac Brooks will discuss the state of mid-sized law firms. This sector saw an increase in demand last year that did not necessarily translate to profit growth. Bill and Isaac will tell us what's up with that and what firms can look to for 2024. If you have questions as we go ahead and put them in the chat. We will be monitoring and taking them on the fly as much as we can. There also should be time at the end for additional questions. Bill and Isaac, take it away.
Thanks, Hillary. Just welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for kind of the state of mid-sized law firms at the beginning of the year here. Where are things standing and where our thoughts are as we kind of go along here. My name is Isaac Brooks. I'm senior analyst for the Financial Insights platform, which falls underneath the Thomson Reuters Institute. Bill will kind of go into the Institute and what we do, but do want to introduce, I've worked on the annual State of Legal Market report, which is pretty much the basis for a lot of the presentation we're about to go through here today. But obviously with that mid-sized law firm tilt, and work on the Law Firm Financial Index, Australia State of Legal Market, and various other reports that are kind of more law firm facing, and kind of digging into the financial side of law firms. We can learn so much about the industry and where things are heading. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bill to introduce himself.
Thanks, Isaac. I recognize a few of the names on the call. My name is Bill Jostin. I guess the title I've made up for myself is Legal Marketplace Innovations Insight Strategist with the Thomson Reuters Institute. Essentially what that means is it's a lot of words to say that I'm ultimately responsible for the creation and curation of thought leadership content for essentially anybody who has or works for someone who has a JD pretty much anywhere in the world. The Thomson Reuters Institute is the official thought leadership arm of the broader TR enterprise. The good thing about what we do is we are not tied to marketing. We're not tied to sales. You're not going to be getting a product pitch from us today. This isn't a product demo. What Isaac and I are really tasked to do, along with the rest of the Institute team, is really looking at the current state of affairs for all of the various customer segments served by Thomson Reuters. But for Isaac and I specifically, it's the legal market. We work on both the buy side and the sell side to, one, listen to the conversations that are happening in the market and to bring TR's perspective to those conversations. We try to do that in a very data-intensive and evidence-based way, also drawing on a lot of our years of experience in monitoring the market from the intersection of the buy and the sell side. The other thing that we do a lot of is we look for conversations that the data and our evidence tells us the market should be having, but for whatever reason isn't having yet. And we try to figure out how can we spark some of those conversations, how can we have some of those discussions. And the presentation today is really going to demonstrate both of those things, where we're going to look at what the evidence is telling us, what the data tells us we need to be thinking about for today, and also what are things that is hidden in the data that we can bring to the market, we can start to have some conversations around, and that's really what's going to help drive the direction forward throughout the rest of 2024 and as we start to position for 2025, even as strange it is to think about positioning for 2025 come 7th of March. But it's never too early to start kind of having an eye toward that and figuring out what that needs to look like. So with that, a lot of stuff to get through today. There is a chat function and a Q&A function enabled on the presentation today. If you have questions as we go along, please feel free to throw them into either one of those tools. We'll be monitoring them as we go. We may take some questions as we flow along. If things sort of fit, if we're going to, if things fit into the point that we're talking about them, maybe we'll take the questions then. If we're going to answer it a couple slides later, we'll maybe let it go, and then we'll catch up with anything we may have missed at the end of today's session. But we absolutely welcome those questions, and I look forward to seeing what's at top of mind for everybody on the call. So with that, Isaac, let's talk about where things stand today.
No, it's funny. He talks about how Thomson Reuters Institute isn't pitching products, but at the same time, it is important that we talk about the data that kind of powers this. So this is my one little not pitch, but just kind of awareness builder here. Most of the data in this is coming from our financial insights platform, which ties it directly into the time and billing system of 240 law firms around the globe. This data set we're looking at right here is about the 180 that we have in the US market. And to talk about the segmentation, we cover AmLaw 100 firms, AmLaw second 100 firms, and then kind of the group we're talking about today are mid-size firms. Those are firms with revenue that kind of fall outside of the top 200 in the country. Also kind of in this presentation will be insights from market insights, which is drawn off of general counsel data, trying to kind of get at the buy side of the equation with law firms. And Bill will be kind of speaking about that. And then in addition, we have some research from our Future of the Professions report, which was a report we kind of set aside. It was kind of a big deal for us last year, where we were really going through all kind of different legal industry, tax and accounting professionals to kind of feel where they are at with generative AI. And you'll see that towards the end of the presentation. And then just to kind of talk about all those data sources fit into the State of the Legal Market report. We've been doing that report with Georgetown for almost 10 plus years now. And me and Bill work on this. And so we kind of know this stuff inside and out. So if there is any questions about definitions or terms, those are ones that we really want to make sure that are shored up. So those are ones we'll for sure answer as we go along. But to kind of start off with kind of the high level overview, today's legal market in a nutshell, it kind of starts with the massive difference we saw in talent strategies in 2023. We saw that mid-sized firms grew dramatically, while AmLaw 100 firms were much more conservative in their headcount management. So they started to trim staff over the course of the summer. These are all things we're going to dive into in great detail and the reasons why. So overall, though, even though we saw that top of the market kind of paring back, headcount growth still outpaced demand. So we continue to see lower productivity on an hours worked per lawyer basis. What are we talking about when we talk about demand? Demand is just the billable hours worked in the industry. So it's just a kind of, not necessarily the demand in the market, but is the demand that is met by law firms. That drag on productivity has been a long-term thing. It continues to this day, but at the same time, we did see productivity declines start to lessen. So this is one of Bill's favorite sayings, less bad is a good thing. And then in addition, that last kind of part was interesting was while we saw some more conservative headcount growth from those top AmLaw firms, by the end of the year, we did see another kind of escalation of the salary scales, and we'll kind of talk about the implications for what that means for 2024. Rates were extremely strong, but we did see some maybe backlash or how clients are starting to kind of navigate, this strong rate growth. So what the rates we're talking about here are worked rates. So standard rate is kind of the sticker price. Once you've negotiated a matter, that's the worked rate. That's what we're typically talking to. But we also collect the billing rate and the collected rate. So we kind of looking at the differences in those rate strategies, that's where we can kind of start to see the client interactions showing up in law firm performance. All three segments saw really strong worked rate growth. We saw that the AmLaw 100 outpaced our data going all the way back to 2005, those pre-GFC, those really kind of wild times in the economy. And so that was a huge tailwind for those firms. But that's is where we're starting to get to. That had some sort of cost. So we saw realization continue to slide. And then at the end of the year, it started to stabilize. That could be looked at as a good thing that it started to stabilize. But at the same time, realization rates tend to improve throughout the year. So a stabilization still kind of shows somewhat of a negative impact on that. And then this is a vague bullet here, mostly because we kind of have to show the slide to explain it, but clients are compensating in various different ways, and Bill is going to kind of dive into that. And one of the really interesting parts, I think, about late 2022 and in early 2023, we saw this greater evidence of demand mobility. So when we talk about demand mobility, it's that work that was typically done by a top of market firm starts to shift its way down. And that has been a very beneficial trait for mid-sized firms, which has led and kind of helped them be the leaders in demand growth or those billable hours worked for the second consecutive year. This provided cost savings to the client, even as all of the market pressed even higher on their rate growth. And then we have kind of a little bit of more of the specifics in terms of the lower cost firms and the AFAs being more highly noted in our database. And that's something that we're going to kind of dive into later as well. But you have this giant open space on the right here. All of these kind of seem to be spurred by the operating environment we are in. So I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly. So this is that demand growth we were talking about. So the billable hours worked by our transactional practices, which we list as general corporate work, mergers and acquisitions, real estate, and tax. And then we have our countercyclical practices, which are litigation, labor employment, and bankruptcy. Why do we name these practices the way they are? So transactional practices, they tend to be cyclical in nature. So from a macroeconomic perspective, when the business cycle is doing really well and there's a lot of corporate activity and firms are trying to do deals and the stock market's up and all those things, that is a very strong environment for transactional work, which then leads to better performance for law firms. Countercyclical practices are practices that do better, relatively better, when the economy is struggling. So we can kind of go through where we have the great financial crisis. When we're kind of looking at these two growth rates, you can see the relative performance of litigation, labor, employment, and bankruptcy was so much greater than the steep contraction we saw in transactional practices. And then we kind of move forward into the transactional decade, where we can see when we had really, really low interest rates trying to spur the economy out of that great financial crisis, that really did turn up corporate activity. Corporations got larger, the corporate legal departments they had got larger, and there was just so much more to kind of deal with. And you can see that over the course of that whole time period, except for this little blip we have in 2018, transactional practices led demand growth. And this is where AmLaw 100 firms really started to lean into, okay, this is a really beneficial practice for us. And we see that their proportion or their weight towards transactional practices became greater and greater and greater. And then we kind of move on to our last kind of period in time, and that's the pandemic volatility. And as you can see, the lines start to go to the lows and to the high side and create extreme degrees. But this is where you can kind of start to see where initially COVID, lockdowns in place, stunted business activity, to an even greater extent to our countercyclical practices, which are heavily kind of indexed on litigation. Courts being closed, that led to them kind of dealing with a lot more pain. But then we had the stimulus, the ultra low interest rates trying to kind of keep the economy going outside the pandemic. Now that's where we saw a transactional surge that we've really never seen before. And now where are we at as we kind of rounded into 2022? Well, we had all of that robust kind of cheap capital in the marketplace. Now they started to turn the faucet down in terms of rising interest rates. That starts to provide kind of unease to the market at large about, should I do this transaction? Should I do this? And what else happens when, business activity becomes more difficult or the ability to get capital gets more difficult? You're more likely to try to hold on to the gains or the revenue that you have. So that's why we talk about litigation does well in bad economic times. It's because they're more likely to sue someone when their entire focus is maintaining their revenue instead of continuing to grow it further and further and further. The interesting part about this is economic indicators have kind of suggested we haven't really went into a recession. And so most of this transactional decline we've been seeing is just comparing against the great heights that we saw in 2021 and early 2022. The interesting part is that countercyclical practices have continued. So this could be, a leading indicator for maybe some more trouble, or it could be more of the economy is certain pockets of the economy are really struggling while others are doing extremely well. And that's where we can kind of get into an environment where some sectors of the economy are really driving transactional and others are driving countercyclical. Right now, it's kind of tilted towards our countercyclical practices. And kind of walking through this whole history lesson, and I know that it probably wasn't that exciting, but this is a very strong environment and a new environment for law firms. They haven't been used to seeing where countercyclical practices like litigation, labor, and bankruptcy are leading. And that is what is somewhat driving the staffing decisions we saw on the left, where we have the big AmLaw 100 firms that are more transactionally focused. They were conservative because of the transactional waning, while mid-sized firms that are more litigation focused, they saw this as an opportunity to continue to beef up and kind of bring things forward. Inflation plays a role here, but we're going to save that for a little later of a section. But to kind of tie that in business environment to our staffing changes, I'm going to pull this chart up here. So what we have here is a little bit different than the chart before. That was kind of year over year growth. Headcount is a little finicky in the fact that, when you move into a new month, you have to fill that bucket with hours. For headcount, the next month starts at the same headcount. So we kind of have to pick a fixed point in time to be able to measure change in a way that is intuitive. And so basically, if we look at January of 2022, you can see that all of our market segments here are at 0%. That means that January of 22 versus January 2022 should be 0%. And then every point after here, so say July of 2022, you would say that the top 50 firms are down about 1% on average compared to their headcount at the beginning of the year. And so you can see how that kind of plays out over the course of the last 2 years. And these are where I kind of want to focus on how we get to the conclusion that the environment is somewhat driving the staffing decisions. So coming out of 2021, that historic transactional demand, we started to see inflation and interest rates become more of an issue for transactional practices. And you can see over the course of 2021, there was this trimming from AmLaw 50 firms that deviated from our all firm average line. Then in 2023, where we were continuing to see inflation rates, interest rates were not going to be coming down anytime soon. There was a lot less optimism that, transactional practices were going to return, and all of the expense growth that they've kind of taken on to kind of try to capture that transactional work led to those top 50 firms really starting to deviate from the all firm average over the course of the summer of 2023. By the end of the summer of 2023, you can see that this line almost touches zero. So this effectively means that in August of 2023, they had the same headcount on average than they would have had in January of 2022, after taking on an entire class in a normally large class of associates. So it wasn't that they erased that entire set of associates that came on. It was that was effectively the size of the reductions that those firms did. Contrast that with our mid-size firms. You could even say that about any of our other segments, but mid-size kind of set themselves aside in terms of their growth, where you can see right around when the AmLaw 100 firms started to trim, they started to pick up some of their headcount before hiring season even had begun. You can also see that the second 50 did not adopt nearly the same strategy of the top 50. And that's where you can start to see the dichotomy of the top 50 is even more transactionally focused, and they didn't see their opportunities. This was exclusively a very top of the market kind of trimming, and that didn't necessarily fall all the way through. But what this kind of talks to me about is you see this little rise here, you see this rise during the kind of the beginning of the layoffs, and you can see it somewhat in the other two segments. It just gives off an opportunity that these other segments saw. I normally can't scoop up, and I can't normally compete for maybe some of the same lawyers that those top 50 firms did. Now they're laying some off. They see an unbelievable opportunity in a great operating environment. That's why this headcount growth from those other firms was really, really strong. And you can see the solid logic behind it. However, the cost of this expansion was it was hard to kind of equate the strength and the ideas behind it with the actual results. And that's kind of the short-term, long-term equation that we'll get into later on.
Isaac,
go ahead.
I think it's important to point out on these slides that this isn't the segment as a whole. This is the average firm in the segment. So we're not saying that the entirety of AmLaw 50 was basically back at 0.0 in August of 23, that the average firm in the AmLaw 50. So some were maybe a little bit still above water in headcount. Others had gone negative. The other thing that I think is really important about these data points is when you see midsize growing, part of that is, like you said, it's an opportunistic capture of talent. Law firm talent is available when it's available. You buy it now. It's a little bit like finding something on a clearance shelf. You buy it when it's there because you come back tomorrow, it's not going to be there anymore. So it's a very opportunistic acquisition. The other thing is, this is a bit of what I've taken to call it talent recapture. The AmLaw 100 hired away lawyers from mid-sized firms throughout a good chunk of 21 and even a little bit into the early part of 22. And then as they shed those heads back out, they went back to mid-sized firms because we've got the baseline set at January of 22. Anybody who left a mid-sized firm to go to an AmLaw 100 firm in 21 shows as a new head in 22 or 23, even though it's really just sort of a revolving door type of a transaction. But it does show that mid-sized firms were really focused on that growth. And I think part of that is due to trying to address some long-term systemic succession issues that mid-sized law firms have. It's not uncommon to see a mid-sized law firm that is rectangular, if not conical shaped in terms of their leverage. You know, you may find a mid-sized law firm, 120 lawyers, for 60 of them are partners. You got to have a wider base than that from a succession planning standpoint, or you have to be able to retain 100% of your associates to be able to have the number of bodies you need to pass the work on to. So mid-sized law firms see, hey, there's an opportunity to grab some talent and some really good experienced talent in the market. They're jumping on that. And I don't think that's a wrong thing to do. I don't think that the AmLaw 50 is wrong to be shedding heads. I don't think the mid-sized law firms are wrong to be picking them up. It's opportunistic on both sides. But as you mentioned, Isaac, there were costs and consequences to that in terms of how it impacted profitability on both sides of that equation.
Right. The last thing I kind of wanted just to touch on, and I wanted to kind of simplify the chart a little bit more, just to kind of focus on that, the top end and the bottom end of the market, or the largest and smallest segments in terms of law firm size, is that you probably have noticed these lines, they tend to rise during the months of August to November. And that's no surprise to anyone in the industry. And you can kind of see that that's hiring season. And in 2022, you could see that hiring season was actually really similar for all three of the segments. Their starting points were a little bit different because of what their actions over the course of the summer, but in terms of the amount of heads they brought on was very similar and historically large. This is where it's kind of even more interesting to kind of talk about staffing from the lag perspective. The associates that were hired here were probably offered before January or by the end of March of this year. And that's when the market was still doing really well. This is before the war in Ukraine. This is before interest rates really started to show that they were going to have an absolute rise. And to avoid kind of the reputational risk, even though they have acknowledged over the course of the summer that they were over capacity, they still brought on the same amount of associates. Well, did they learn from those lessons? Did they was their mind thinking a lot different, in March of the following year? If we take those exact same sized lines from 2022's hiring season and put them over kind of the hiring season of 2023, this is where you can see that all market segments somewhat were conservative in their new year associate comeback. So the difference between this top of this line and here kind of shows how much less associates they brought on than the year previous. And that starts to get wider and wider as we go down to our orange line at the bottom here. The one thing that I just wanted to make sure that was kind of noticing here was, while the hiring during associate class season was similar, you also see that them having smaller associate classes was similar. What was the differentiator? What was the thing that actually led to the difference in their profitability? It was the actions they made over the course of both summers in terms of trimming staff. And that's a much more drastic action. And that was somewhat what was required for the top of the market to kind of achieve the profit growth, while the rest of the market started to kind of fall behind in the short term. Just to kind of suss out exactly what we were talking about on the associate side and the first year headcount change in 2023, we have this table here, but I'm going to pass it over to Bill to kind of take in the other parts of the mid-size angle and how productivity is shaking out.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've already talked a lot about the big differences in headcount strategy. To me, what's really interesting about this is when you look at the associate headcount change compared to the first year headcount change, what that tells us is a lot of the divergence in the trends that we saw in the prior slides is really due to hiring of not brand new talent, but capitalizing on, like we said before, that available talent that's in the market that maybe hadn't been in the past, looking at people that have a certain level of experience. You know, we can see Midsize, their first year class this past fall was actually 3% smaller than it was the year prior. And yet over the course of the year, the associate ranks grew by almost 12%. That means that they're aggressively hiring associates, but they're not hiring brand new people. They're bringing in experienced people. So that's why that's at least the theory that I expressed before. They're looking for succession opportunities. They're looking to expand their meaningful leverage, not just bring in brand new bodies, but bring in people that can bring in a certain level of expertise and a certain level of experience. So they're contributing more meaningfully to the profitability of the firm. But it's a simple process of math. When you've got relatively soft demand versus high headcount, you take a small number divided by a big number, you get a pretty small remainder or a pretty small quotient. That's what we're seeing in terms of productivity. Productivity is outpacing demand pretty much across the market. This has been a thing. This is nothing new. But when we see the year-to-date pace of demand growth compared to this type of a trend in headcount growth, that's what's going to drive that performance down. Now, we did see some differences in terms of the demand performance, particularly in the countercyclical practices. We looked at those before. What's really significant about that is when you look at how those countercyclicals performed. You know, we saw the overall trend line of countercyclical performance. For mid-sized law firms, their best performance for countercyclical practices came from litigation, which grew at 4.4%. For the AmLaw second 100 and the first 100, it was bankruptcy, and that grew by 6.9% for the 100 and 3.7% for the second 100. The difference is, so even though the demand growth as a percentage was bigger for the 200 segments than it was for the mid-size, the proportionality really factored in. Mid-sized law firms saw on average 4.4% growth in a practice area that's a quarter of their total demand, whereas the AmLaw 200 segment saw really strong demand growth, but in a segment or in a practice that's only 2% of their total demand. So the lift that the countercyclical practices brought to the overall performance of the firms for the mid-size segment was dramatically more than it was for either the 200 segments. Even with that, though, a metric that we look at called average daily demand, which is the number of hours put in the book per day, for all three segments, that still didn't come back to where it was even in 2022. We've seen a systemic decline in productivity metrics over the course of the last several years. And Isaac, I know we got a lot to get through in the next 29 minutes here, plus Q&A time, but you know, you can go out and find some of the work that we've done. We're sort of starting to operate under an assumption that from a productivity standpoint, we may have hit the last peak that we can expect. We saw a peak of productivity in 2021. That may be the last peak that we see. The practice of law is just fundamentally shifting right now. The way that we practice law is fundamentally shifting. That's not to say that law firms are doomed to a future of lower profit. Certain law firms may struggle from profit, but those law firms that can reimagine how they define productivity and how they get money out of their work output, they're going to be poised to do just fine in terms of their profitability growth. But when we look at particularly like generative AI and some of those other things that we'll talk about more later, this idea of productivity declining is pretty much an inevitability at this point. It's a trend we've seen for 15 years, and it's not something that we see in the tea leaves as being likely to reverse itself anytime soon. But like I said, there's a little bit more on that later in the presentation, and there's a ton of work that we've written about that, so you can go out and read that as well. ThomsonReuters.com/institute is where everything's at. It's all free. You can go out and grab it anytime. But just in terms of that productivity decline, it is something that we're watching, but something that we're not expecting a lot of improvement in. Isaac, you want me to take this part?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I'll segue then saying we expect improvement. Where we have actually seen a lot of improvement is in rates. The big driver of rates, where productivity has not been a driver of rates for law firms, rates really has been. And again, here we're talking about work rates, or the rate that a client agrees to pay to engage a matter, the agreed rate. Each segment posted really strong growth in 2022 or 2023. The AmLaw 100 at 7.6%, that was actually above where they were prior to the GFC. So really, really tremendous growth for the AmLaw 100. And even mid-sized firms at 5.3%. That was almost a point and a half. In fact, I think it's exactly a point and a half where they were at the end of 2022, and compares pretty favorably to where they were prior to GFC. At 2022, they finished the year growing by about 3.8%, and they really stepped on the gas. Every segment was at least 0.8 of a percentage point higher compared to the prior year. So that's really, really good. There's a question around how sustainable that's going to be. Early indications are from 2024 that it's probably going to be the case throughout much of 24. And frankly, for me personally, if we do start to see it cool a little bit, if we see mid-sized law firm rate growth go from 5.3 to 4.0, I'm not necessarily going to be ringing alarm bells over that. That's still going to be 4% growth on top of 5.3% growth on 3.8% growth. It's still going to be historically high. So if there is some cooling of rates, that's not necessarily a huge concern. What's more concerning to me in terms of the overall picture for law firms in 2024 and beyond is how those rates translate into profit. Part of that is going to be something we've already touched on, which is the expenses related to the headcount. We saw a lot of mid-sized firms taking on additional headcount. Every one of those comes with a fairly hefty price tag. That did have an impact that we'll put some numbers to in a minute here on mid-sized law firm profits per lawyer and profits per equity partner throughout the course of 2024 or 2023. So that's going to continue to be a concern, that expense side. But it's also the realization of the capture side. How do I turn my rates into actual collected dollars? And we talked about this a little bit on the nutshell slide, but we saw realization decline. Realization was down a full percentage point in 2023 compared to 2022. And with that slide, again, as Isaac pointed out, that's not something we typically see. We typically see quarter-on-quarter improvements over the course of the year as firms become more cost conscious and more cash collection conscious. Well, all that really resulted in for 2023 was a stabilization of realization. For most segments, we saw a 4, if not 5 consecutive quarter decline in realization. Now, it's easy to say, well, yeah, look at the rate growth here, where we're looking at 7.6 to 5.6, 5.3% rate growth. Of course, there's going to be decline in realization. Clients are going to be revolting against that and pushing back. And that's an easy answer. Unfortunately, it's not right. When we look at the numbers, there's a little bit of client pushback. More of what we see, though, in terms of decline in realization is a decline in firm behavior around rates. We track realization several different ways, but the two key ways are we look at what we call billing realization and collected realization. Billing realization is the percentage of what the client agreed to pay that they're actually billed, and collected is the percentage of what the client agreed to pay that we actually collect from them. Interestingly, those two lines tend to travel in parallel. As billing realization goes up, collected realization tends to trend up with it to within a couple of tenths of a percentage point. Similarly, when billing realization starts to go down, collected realization goes down with it. We saw this industry-wide from 2022 or from 2020 really through the end of 2022, where that trend line is moving up. That was because billing realization was pulling that metric up. You flip over the calendar from 22 to 23, billing realization starts to decline, collected realization goes right with it. So as we're looking forward into 23 or into 24 and beyond, that's something we really want to be cautious about. Is we really want to be conscious of how are we protecting that billing process internally. This is something I do personally a ton of work on. It's a process that we call fee erosion and revenue assurance, where you're looking at how do we degrade from the full fee of what the client should owe us to what we actually collect. That's the fee erosion process. And how do we protect against that? What sort of practices do we need to put in place? That's the revenue assurance part. But that's going to be a big key for it. With that in mind, in that context around revenue realization, every segment did ultimately see growth in profits per lawyer. The AmLaw 100 was the strongest in terms of growth, even though mid-sized law firms had really strong rate growth and led the market for the second year straight in demand. That didn't turn into market-leading profit performance. And most of that is due to the headcount trends that we saw earlier. They saw big growth in what we call their direct expenses throughout the course of 23. That put a damper on their profit growth potential for the year.
Yeah, and the only thing I would just add, because I find it really interesting, is, you know, we talk about how the AML 100 really kind of led, and we saw that they actually were kind of in a struggling environment in terms of the actual demand. They also were kind of the main drivers of this decline from 2022 to 2023, where you can see slight declines in the other two segments. The AML 100 really kind of took a more meaningful step back. So we'll kind of relate that to something else here in a second. But one other thing that I think is a really important thing we want to kind of talk about, and so I blew up that chart in the top right to kind of more focus in on it, is the relationship that our segments have with inflation. And one thing I just kind of want to point out is that the difference between the rates that are increasing and this inflation measure that we're using kind of shows the real pricing power that that law firms are actually gaining from the marketplace. Why do we use PCE inflation? PCE inflation excludes food and energy prices, which are extremely volatile. In addition, those kind of materials aren't really needed to procure law firm services, so they're not necessarily quite the impact on law firm finances. And so when you kind of take that into account and you kind of look at, the relationship between rates and inflation seems to correlate pretty well as you look through the 2010s, where you could see that every single year, we have a peak here of inflation and kind of a peak here of worked rate growth. That ticks down. We see low points here. We kind of tick back up. And so that you can see that they tend to track alongside one another quite well. This gap is about like 1.5 to 2%. Pre-GFC time, when you would kind of say that we were in much more of a seller's market, that gap was near 5. You can kind of start to see this seller's market start to widen during 19 and 22. But what was really interesting, and we haven't seen inflation really in this country get up to the levels that we saw over the last 2 years in quite some time. This is where we can see that law firms and the way they set prices had led to a couple other problematic things over the last 2 years, and what somewhat resolved itself in 2023. So because law firms set their prices at the very beginning of the year, if inflation rips through like it did towards the end of 2021 and continued into 2022, you can see that we had our smallest gap between these two measures. And in 2022, we saw that this actually inverted, where this is the first time we'd ever seen that inflation actually exceeded worked rate growth. So if you were billing an hour, that was actually, even with your wage growth, was actually worth less real dollars. And why is that particularly important for midsize? Well, they tend to be on the lower end of rate growth in terms of, while the average firm was only a little bit below inflation, mid-sized firms were significantly below inflation. And so kind of understanding where the inflation is at and adjusting your prices accordingly has been good business practices. And it seems like that was a main driver of why 2023 was so great, where we were at the peak of inflation at the end of 2022. No idea if it was going to slow down. Law firm said, hey, I don't think we need to, jinx it here. We have all this, expansion in our headcount and all these things. And that's what somewhat led to the record highs we're seeing in 2023. 2023 also brought us the easing of inflation as that significant kind of drop at the end of the year. And so this brings up kind of an interesting discussion point for Bill and I of where do rates kind of wiggle out in 2024? Well, if inflation is any kind of indicator, you would say that is probably towards the south side. But in addition, you could make an argument that because they were down or behind pace for the last 2 years, maybe this is the time they need to kind of catch up and continue to get maybe some of the largest gaps. Like this gap here in 2023 was 3.3%. We haven't seen that wide of a gap other than 2022 since pre-GFC days. So we are starting to get some of that data in. And I'll just kind of say it is very similar to the results we're seeing in 2023. And that kind of provides some optimism for kind of revenue generation in the upcoming year.
Yeah, and I think we're in an interesting position right now where for the first time really ever, we're seeing law firm rates, certainly in 23 and a little bit in 24. 23, we saw law firm rates or rate growth indexed to inflation for really the first time ever. Law firms never looked at inflation before. They just always happened to have an advantage over it. 21 or 22, they realized they're behind. 23, they realized they have to catch up. So they pushed the gas a little bit. Now I think they're actually in a bit of a catch-22, where we saw such strong rate growth. And this is why I talked earlier, slowing of rate growth doesn't necessarily trouble me. The reason I'm putting that out there is because there's plenty of commentators in the market that if you see rate growth starting to cool, the immediate headlines are going to be law firms are struggling because rates aren't growing as fast. Well, that's not necessarily true, because we're not seeing rates recede. And especially if there's still an advantage relative to inflation, you still have additional buying power. But no one really wants to take their foot off the gas and be the first one to make that move. It's sort of a classic story. Law firms never want to be first. They always want to be first to be second. Well, in this instance, definitely nobody wants to be first, with a few exceptions. There are a few firms that always want to be the lowest cost option on the block. And there's arguments to that strategy. But generally speaking, for the industry, you want to try and do what you can to keep up with the Joneses. And so you don't want to be falling too far behind, because your rate structure does convey a certain amount of prestige. And if you're seen as, there's a fine line between being lower cost and being cheap, and those are not the same thing. And clients will certainly view with a different perspective. And if you're growing your rate significantly off pace vis-a-vis the market, people are going to notice. So if you're a firm that's reporting, hey, we're only growing rates, and I'm going to make these numbers up, but we're only growing rates by 3% this year, we're only growing by 6% last year, you do run the risk in certain circles of the legal media, again, not from us, but other circles of the legal media, of them saying, oh, well, this firm cut their rate growth in half. They're clearly struggling. And you don't want that going out to your partners. So I've been asked a lot of times, and my answer has been, I don't see anything in the offing that tells me rates need to adjust in 2024. It may happen, and it's not going to disturb me if it does. But I don't necessarily see firms being the main driver of it. More of where clients are going to be pushing back is through what we've already talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about more in a second here, with that demand mobility. And we should probably get moving to that, Isaac. We're going to run out of time here in a real big hurry. That demand mobility, as we see it accelerating, you can see the difference in demand growth. Now, this is through November of last year, but you can see the difference in demand growth. We talked earlier, for example, about 4.4% growth in litigation for the mid-size segment, where you can see the 2.4% there compared to basically flat demand for the AmLaw 100. This is, as Isaac was talking about, the result of that work starting to shift down market and more into the mid-size space. Clients are being very clear with us about what they want. Their cost control strategies, this is based off of interviews that we do with around 2,500 corporate GCs every year. And we ask them, which of these are going to be part of your, and it's a significant part, that's the way it's phrased, it's a significant part of your cost control strategies in the coming 12 months. There's a few surprises in here for me personally. One is around AFAs. We see 54% of GCs saying that they want to be using more AFAs. But AFAs are going to be a significant portion of their cost control strategy. Well, first of all, what the heck's an AFA? AFA, the acronym literally stands for Alternative Fee Arrangement. It does not mean we're going to apply a discount to the billable hour. That is not an alternative fee arrangement. With an AFA, we're looking at really strict forms of budgets. We're looking at caps. We're looking at collars. We're looking at fixed fees. Those are what we're talking about. Subscription pricing is becoming very popular. If you want to have a discussion around any of those particular options, please reach out. Happy to have that discussion offline for the sake of time. We have seen a trend where AFAs have been stuck at about 20% of law firm revenues for the last 10 years. With that number of clients, 54% of clients saying that they want AFAs to be a significant part of their cost control strategies in the next 12 months, frankly, the impetus is on them to make that happen, because you can only put forward the billing arrangement that the client's actually going to agree to. When we talk to clients about why they don't do more on AFAs, they say, well, because our law firms don't give us good options. When you talk to the law firms, why don't you give your clients better options? They say, well, it's because the only thing they'll agree to is a billable hour arrangement anyway. So the impetus is really on the client to make this happen, but they're saying they want to. So it's going to be incumbent upon firms to maybe do dual pricing. This is what we charge you for the hour, or if you want to do something alternative, here's an alternative pricing arrangement, and explain the benefits to that. It's at least an educational thing, and you show that you're putting that option out there. This is something large firms are doing. So even as we see the second part here, where clients are seeking out lower cost firms, larger firms are being very competitive on the pricing side, really trying to lean in, into their pricing expertise in terms of what clients want from an AFA. But that data point around moving work to lower cost firms, we hear all the time clients saying, oh, we want to move our work portfolio around, we're going to realign our panel, we're going to consolidate work into firms where we get greater value. What we haven't seen before is half of clients specifically saying we want lower cost firms. That's new. That's a little bit surprising. So the headline here for me is, it's not surprising that they want them, it's that how many want them. That's really the tail of the tape for me. And as we see this shifting, this demand mobility accelerating, the shift of demand towards the mid-sized firms seeking out lower cost firms, it is having an impact in the effective rates that clients are paying. Even as we look on the prior slide for what those rates look like, we saw the figure 16 up here. By the way, all of these figures are reproduced directly from the report. There's nothing in here that doesn't come directly from the report. Figure 16, these are numbers that we pulled actually at the midpoint of last year. And the reason we did that is because this is information that comes from, everything in the gray boxes comes from a data source that we have called Legal Tracker. It looks at e-billing data. So it's as billing invoices go through the actual payment systems. That operates on more of a lag than our financial insights data does. So we have to figure out when we can pull those contemporaneously. We can pull the financial insights data up through November for the State of the Legal Market report. We can't pull tracker data through November. We have to pull it basically on a quarter end, and mid-year is a much better indicator than Q3. That's really why we pulled it through June. But it still makes for a really interesting comparison. Average law firm work rates as of June of last year was 5.7%. It finished up higher than that, but it was 5.7% through the mid-year point of last year. If you look at the table, every single timekeeper classification for every single band of business was in negative territory. They were actually paying less than a year prior for every single group of timekeeper, regardless of the size of business. How on earth is that possible? Like, how could you be negative, be contracting the rates? Well, we decided to prove it out. We put together a hypothetical. And this is really just us spitballing to see, does this even make sense? So we came up with sort of a hypothetical segmentation. Mid-sized law firm, AmLaw 200 law firm, AmLaw 100 law firm. The collected rates column that you see there, those are actual real world dollar value rates. The average collected rates for those segments per the financial insights. That's not us guessing, that's actual real world data. And then we looked at what sort of proportion would we need to see. So we started with just a hypothetical even split. 35% of work was done by the AmLaw 200, 35% by the 100, and the balance, the 30% done by the mid-sized firms. And then if you go down to where it says growth rate the client experienced, that's negative 3.3%. We wanted to get a negative number there that was in the ballpark for what we see for figure 16. Negative 3.3%, right in the middle of the bullseye for the timekeeper classification figure 16. How much work had to shift for that number to happen? When you look at the proportion of work in 2023, 50% of work is now being done by mid-size, 30% by the 200, 20% by the 100. Now, it's important to note that doesn't mean that 15% of the work that was done by the AmLaw 100 was taken from the 100 and moved to the mid-sized firms. That did happen to an extent, but this is proportional. The way I've explained this in the past is, assume our hypothetical client here is a $100 million portfolio of business in 2020, in 2022. In 2023, that portfolio is $120 million. I had given, of that $100 million, the AmLaw 100, again, I have one AmLaw 100 firm that had been $1 million of business out of that $100 million portfolio in 2022, they were $900,000 in 2023. It's a $100,000 difference to them, but to them, it's going to look like a rounding error. They're not going to necessarily see, oh my gosh, we've lost a ton of work. Well, that $100,000 ended up shifting to a mid-sized firm. But then all 20 million of growth in the portfolio that went from 100 million to 120 million all went to lower cost firms. The AmLaw 100 firms never even had a sniff at it. So that's when we look at where proportionality is really an important thing. And when you think about it in that context, this hypothetical becomes very approachable very quickly. And the idea that we could end up with a negative rate makes all the sense in the world. And we're seeing it. The data doesn't lie. The numbers are real. We've seen this happen. We can see it in the demand figures. We can see it in the rate figures. This favors very favorably for mid-sized law firms. It's very concerning for the AmLaw 100, but the AmLaw 100 also has the bench strength to be able to start to combat this from a marketing and business development standpoint. So there are certain strategies. We got a slide coming up here talking about the good news. There's a lot of potential good news for mid-sized and second 100 firms. Isaac, I don't know if you had particular talk tracks here. You want me to just keep on a roll?
You're doing great.
All right, good deal. So good news, point number one, the buyer sentiment remains largely positive. One of the things that we ask general counsel is, do you expect your spend on outside legal counsel to go up, go down, or stay the same? We take we take the go up, we subtract the go down, and we use that to calculate what we call a net spend anticipation score. 40% of clients expected to go up, 22% expected to go down, NSA score of 18. Now that's actually near a historic high. So that sentiment remains very, very positive. For a while, we actually called this figure net spend optimism, and then I presented it to an audience of corporate GCs. One of them raised his hand and said, I'd just like to call you out here. I anticipate my spend's going to go higher. I'm not necessarily optimistic about that fact. I thought, that's a really fair point. So we changed it from net spend optimism to net spend anticipation. But they do anticipate growth going up. And interestingly, they expect a higher spend on net, on both regulatory, which I think is entirely understandable given the current regulatory landscape, but also corporate work in 2024. That's interesting to me. Perhaps clients are looking at a little bit of positive sentiment towards transactional practices coming back. It's not necessarily translating a lot into M&A, but general corporate work, that's a favorable thing. Clients also appear to be reverting to old preferences. Clients are telling us they're showing a lot more preference to global coverage of a law firm. They're looking at specialization. They want to see very deep expertise. They also like to see wide expertise. They want a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas out of their law firms. Law firm brand and individual strength is viewed as less important than it was even just a couple years ago. It's not that it's unimportant. It's just that it's less important than it had been. And interestingly, the importance of responsiveness is also rising again. We saw that diminish in importance as a factor in 2020, but I think in 2021 and 22, that's probably due to the fact that we had to shift to remote and everybody was super conscious of being responsive because they weren't in the office. Well, now, one, we're reverting back to office, and two, we've sort of found a stride and we're not that hyper aware about how are we staying in touch. So clients are once again saying, hey, our law firms aren't as responsive as we want them to be. So we are seeing a return to that factor. Where mid-sized law firms in particular have that advantage of a cost benefit, where they potentially stand to lose out is in some of these preference drivers, particularly the global coverage and the specialization. Now, global coverage, larger law firms just have better global reach. They tend to be more frequently having global offices. So that global coverage is a factor that can weigh in their favor if they leverage it correctly. Specialization, well, larger law firms also tend to have access to a larger pool of specialization because they just have a deeper bench. They have more people. So there is an advantage there. However, that doesn't necessarily work against mid-sized law firms if you are the expert that they are looking for in a particular area. If they are looking for somebody who is expert in M&A, it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not you have deep bench strength in intellectual property or estate planning. They're looking for an M&A expert. So you can still use that, but it's just being mindful of how you compete against that message of breadth of coverage of expertise. The other thing to be mindful of too, and this is something I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, but the formula for successful firms is known and has been proven. We do a study every year, or at least we have for the last 7 or 8 years, that we call the Dynamic Law Firm Study. We look at a population of firms that has had market-leading growth in their revenue per lawyer and their profits per lawyer. And this last year, we did a 10-year look back to see the firms that had consistently been in those high-performing categories. What was unique about them? Well, there was a few things. One, they were uniquely able to read the market. Isaac talked before about the shift from transactional to countercyclical practices. Our dynamic law firms tended to be on the leading side of that curve. They were making that shift more readily in terms of their proportionality and their headcount than other areas were. So they were reading the market. They were able to position well. It's the classic Gretzky skate to where the puck is going to be. They also were able to balance demand and capacity. They weren't over hiring when demand was up, and they weren't dramatically shedding headcount when demand was down. They were able to keep a good balance of demand and capacity, and in that way, they were able to protect their productivity. It was not uncommon for us to find dynamic law firms that had actually grown productivity because they were using their headcount to grow into demand rather than trying to use headcount to drive demand. The latter never works. We've seen that as a strategy for law firms for a long time. If we bring in 5% more heads, we'll grow demand by 5%. It never works. So we're trying to we're seeing those dynamic firms balancing that well. And the dynamic firms are also investing well in their professional staff and in their technology. They've got a good bench of people. They're paying them well. They're bringing in the right tech stack. They're leveraging and adopting it well. So that would be a report. If again, it's the Dynamic Law Firms report. I would strongly encourage you to go out, take a look at that, or it's linked from the State of the Legal Market report. Grab yourself a copy of State of the Legal Market and grab it from there, because there's a lot of great insights there in terms of what leads to that type of long-term success.
Hey, Bill, we're close to the end of time. Do you want to get to takeaways or just want to talk generative AI? Doesn't matter to me.
Well, my longstanding joke now has been, if you do a presentation in 2024 and you don't talk about generative AI, have you even done a presentation?
Okay.
But I think we get through the Gen AI stuff very quickly. Generally speaking, there's a lot of positivity around generative AI. People are still hesitant about it, but not pessimistic. And I think there's an important difference there. We'll call it cautious optimism. We've sort of predicted 3 potential scenarios, and these are by no means mutually exclusive, nor are these the only potential scenarios. But the odds of one of these sort of playing out seems fairly high. Potential scenario number 1, both clients and law firms derive value from AI. You work together, clients get better results faster, they get increased creativity, firms get lower cost and better labor efficiency. Firms can still articulate their value, but both generative AI becomes a tool that lifts all boats. Scenario number 2 is clients really lean in and take advantage. They take more work in-house. They're using law firms only for final checks. They're using generative AI and other AI tools to create greater capacity within their department. That's going to put more pricing pressure on firms. It's going to lead to more disaggregation of work so that firms are getting smaller slivers of matters. That's a trend that we've already seen for a number of years now. It could potentially accelerate. And here, failure by the law firm to articulate the value that they bring could be disastrous, because if they're literally just a cost at that point, they're not bringing value, well, then why incur that cost when we can handle it in-house, right? So that's a scenario where it can almost happen if law firms let it happen by default. If law firms choose to sit back and say, well, let's just see what clients want to do with AI, they could find themselves behind the 8 ball. The other thing is it could be just a flash in the pan, something like Second Life or the metaverse. In that instance, AI doesn't have a strategic impact. Its effects are more localized. This is going to happen in functions like marketing, IT, HR, maybe not so much in client work. I'm sorry, in the scenario here, it would make an impact more in marketing, IT, and HR, but maybe not so much in client work. This may be more likely in certain practices where the bespoke nature of the work is really important, but I would certainly not assume that this is going to happen in any given area. It might happen. I would much rather be prepared for scenario 1 or 2 and find myself in scenario number 3 than assume scenario number 3 and if I assume scenario number 3, odds are scenario number 2 is going to happen to me and I'm just going to be left behind. As we look, this is going to be a big year. We're moving from awareness to action with a lot of AI this year. A lot of people are aware of generative AI. That's why I didn't really feel the need to go into a definition of what is generative AI. People understand what AI is now. This year is going to be a year where we start to prove out what is AI capable of and how does it start to work its way into our workflows. So I would absolutely be mindful of what those types of tools are, how other firms are leveraging them, and be experimenting for myself. How could we potentially be leveraging that ourselves? I know we're at time. Did we have anything else we wanted to cover really fast, Isaac? I don't see anything in the Q&A or the chat.
Yeah, I want to give an opportunity for people to kind of ask questions here. And honestly, this is kind of a recap slide anyways. I had a little spiel for it, but at the same time, just to kind of show the profit trends we were kind of discussing, where you can see the AmLaw 100 short-term trends kind of outpacing mid-size firms for all the benefits we just discussed. That's entirely expense driven. And honestly, we could talk about any of these questions for an hour, but these are kind of the big picture things we're kind of thinking about, and the key traits and the things we're trying to take away from 2023. One thing I did want to note just at the end of here is that while mid-sized firms, we talk of all the benefits and all the costs that actually overwhelmed it, this is from a short-term perspective. A hire you make today is going to provide you benefits for years and years and years down the road, hopefully, right? And so if we bring on some, really strong people and they didn't provide us business right away as they were kind of getting themselves established, this could provide a huge, perfect opportunity should counter-cyclical practices continue, should mobile demand continue to be kind of a tailwind. And so we're really optimistic for kind of the lower markets of the world. And we're kind of interested to see, okay, the AML 100 was able to do headcount reductions and get to profit growth. What does that mean for them going forward? So that's all I really wanted to touch on, unless anyone has any questions that we kind of want to discuss.
Not seeing anything coming in. Really appreciate everybody sticking with us for the time today. I hope this was helpful. We're happy to share the deck if that's something that folks would like. Otherwise, Hillary, Norma, thank you so much for the invite today.
Yeah, Bill and Isaac, that was awesome. That's such great data and great analysis. I thought it was really interesting. I had to miss the small firm one, so now I want to go back and watch it. Thank you guys. This was really great. Thank you for coming, and just thanks to the Thomson Reuters Institute for your time and expertise. We love partnering with you. So thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, there's a link to the deck. Thanks, Norma. And we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.